Hi, today's video is going to be about carbohydrates, and we are going to talk about the molecular structure of them and their function. So the name of our notes is carbohydrates. And the first thing that I want to talk about is what they are made of. Okay, but before I get into that, I want you to think of some examples of some carbohydrates. And so when you hear the word carbohydrates, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe bread. So when you think of carbs, you think about bread. What else? What else could be a carbohydrate? Maybe sugar. Maybe some kind of sugar. Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else come to mind when you think of carbohydrate? Well, if there is anything else that comes to mind when you think of carbohydrate, just put it in your notes. Okay. And so all these biomolecules that we're going to be talking about over these 4 videos have small pieces, and the small pieces are what we call monomers. Okay, so monomers are the small pieces, so the small molecules. And then when you put the small molecules together, what we call polymers, the large molecules. Okay. And so the monomers are the small molecules, and the pieces that come together to make a larger molecule, which we call a polymer. And so carbohydrate is a polymer, which means it's made up of lots of small monomers. And so before I get into the structure of the polymer, I want to point out what the monomers are. And so a monomer of a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. So a monosaccharide is what we would call a monomer of a carbohydrate. Okay, is a monomer of a carbohydrate. And so another term for a monosaccharide is a simple sugar. Okay, sometimes referred to as a simple sugar. And so an example of a monosaccharide for a carbohydrate would be a molecule such as glucose. So glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. And so I'm going to draw a glucose molecule for you. And glucose, the chemical formula for glucose is it has 6 carbons. It has 12 hydrogens, and it has 6 oxygens. And the way that we draw it sometimes is we draw it in a carbon ring. So I'm going to draw a carbon ring here that has 6 edges. Okay, so there's 6 points here. Each of these points stands for a carbon. And so keep in mind that each of these edges stands for a carbon. One of them has an oxygen. So we're going to put an oxygen here. This is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon. And then there's a carbon that's attached to one of those carbons like that. And so this is an example of a glucose molecule. There are 6 carbons, and then there are 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. I'm not drawing in all the oxygens and hydrogens because then the picture might get kind of messy. But what you need to know is that it's a ring. Sometimes the glucose molecule will stretch itself out and will go into a linear form like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So glucose can be found in a ring form, like this molecule here, and sometimes it'll stretch out into a linear form, and then it can go back and forth. Okay? So that's glucose. Another example of a monosaccharide is fructose. And fructose has the exact same chemical formula. It has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So it has the same amount of the atoms, but the configuration of the atoms is a little bit different. So I'm going to show you a picture of glucose and fructose side by side so you can see the differences. So here is a picture of fructose, and it's also shown as a carbon ring. And this is a picture of glucose, okay? And so in the glucose carbon ring, you have an oxygen, and then you have a carbon attached to one of the carbons. So these are both considered monosaccharides or a simple sugar. Okay, and then you can have a dehydration reaction occur where the fructose and the glucose combine together to form a bigger molecule. And that bigger molecule we call a disaccharide, because that means it's going to have two saccharides. And so, for example, when a fructose and a glucose combine, it forms a new molecule called sucrose. Okay, and sucrose is the table sugar that we eat every day. It is just one fructose and one glucose together through a dehydration reaction. Okay, and I'm going to show you a picture of that. So here we have the glucose molecule, which is a 6-carbon ring, with the fructose molecule, which is a 6-carbon ring. And they come together through a dehydration reaction, and they make this sucrose molecule, which is the sugar that you have every day in your coffee in the morning. Okay, and so of course the sucrose molecule can then come apart, and that would be called a hydrolysis reaction, and then they can come together, and that's a dehydration reaction. Okay, so that is what carbohydrates are made of. These are some examples of carbohydrates. If you have a large molecule of simple sugars, then we call that a polysaccharide. Saccharide has many simple sugars attached to each other. Okay, and what I would like to give you is some examples of some polysaccharides. I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first example is called starch. Okay, and what starch is a lot of glucose molecules attached to each other in a long string. So many glucose molecules attached to each other. Okay, I'm going to say thousands of glucoses. And so what that would look like is you would have a carbon ring. So this is glucose, which is C6H12O6. And that glucose would be attached to another glucose, and that glucose would be attached to another glucose, and on and on and on. And so starch is what we find in potatoes. That's another carbohydrate. And so like our French fries. So we know what starch tastes like because we love French fries, and French fries are delicious, and so starch is delicious. And so what starch is, and so on and so on. Okay, so many, many more glucose molecules all strung together in a big string. What starch is a molecule that stores energy for the plant. Okay, so let me write that down. So starch, the function for starch is energy storage for plants. Okay, so that is how plants store their energy. Is they get a glucose from food, and then they stick them together to form these long chains of glucose molecules for later if they need energy later. And so they store this, and so they store it like in a potato, for example, and then us as humans, we will take that potato and we'll eat it. And that is like a high source of carbohydrates for us. Okay, but the plant is making it for itself, but we're taking it from the plant. Okay, the second polysaccharide that I want to give you an example of is called glycogen. Okay, and glycogen is also many glucose molecules attached to each other. Okay, so again, thousands of glucoses. Okay, And the difference between the starch and the glycogen is that the starch is what the plant uses for stored energy, but glycogen is what animals use for stored energy. And so it looks very similar to starch. So what'll happen is the plant will store the energy in the form of starch, and then an animal will eat the starch, like the potato, and will break down the glucoses into individual glucose molecules and then rebuild a new string of glucose molecules into what we call glycogen. And so, for example, if you're going to go run a marathon or do some, heavy activity, you probably have heard of carb loading. So you eat like spaghetti or potatoes the night before and you eat a bunch of carbs. What you're doing is you're filling up your glycogen stores. Okay, so you have glycogen in your muscles to store all this glucose so that the next day when you're running your marathon, you have this extra, you have full storage of glucose. So the function of glycogen is energy storage for animals. It's a function for glycogen is energy storage for animals. Okay, and then the last example that I have for you is called cellulose. Cellulose is another polysaccharide. And cellulose is again many glucose molecules attached to each other in a long string. So many glucose molecules attached to each other, thousands of glucoses. Okay, and so all three of these polysaccharides are just a string of glucoses, but they have different functions. Okay, the starch is for the plant storage, the glycogen is for the animal storage, and the cellulose is used for plant cell walls. So cellulose is what plant cells have in their cell walls. Okay, so plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not have a cell wall, but plant cells do have a cell wall, and it is very rigid and hard, and it is made of these long strings of glucoses. And so it is used for plant cell walls. Okay, so that's it for carbohydrates. See you next time.